Good evening. One of my favorite novels in Dutch literature by Elschot de Dwalicht starts with the following sentence: a dreadful November evening with a drizzling rain that swept even the most brave from the street. It is indeed a dreadful November evening, and the most brave are assembled here for a discussion whether it should be allowed that a company pursues other interests than to seek profit, or whether it should be mandatory, or whether it should be forbidden. It's an old question that will be revisited today by two eminent speakers. I will first introduce both of them and then giving the floor to the first speaker. At my right-hand side is Professor Vanberg. Professor Vanberg is originally a sociologist, if I understand well, but is an economist at the university, is an emeritus economist at the University of Freiburg, and was also an economist at the George Mason University, where he worked with James Buchanan, the Nobel Prize winner. He is the president of the Walter Eucken Institute. At my far right side is Professor Marieke Wyckaert, who most people will know here as a professor of corporate law, as an eminent practitioner of corporate law in Belgium, but also as one of the leading authors of the new company code. Each of them will make an opening statement, then they will make a reply, and then a debate will follow. I have been asked to induce you to stay awake by announcing a drink at the end of the debate, but I've also been asked to manage expectations and to announce that the funding by the Inter-University Council for Development Cooperation does not provide for alcohol at the drink. I have to announce that, I'm glad to announce that this evening is organized by the Ecoteam of the Valk, and Eco stands for ecology and not economy here, and I welcome Jette Akkermans, who is the driving force behind this debate. This debate has been co-organized by the student organizations of the law school, VRG, and of the economics department, Ekonomika, and that both of them work together. That's something like North Korea and South Korea organizing a fancy fair. That's a rare and special event, and it underscores the importance of this event. I'm happy to give the floor to our first debater, Professor Wyckaert.
Thank you, colleague Vananroye. Can you hear me? Because I'm not sure this is working. Yeah, it's okay? Yeah. And this one, can you see? Yeah, I think that's going to be right. Right, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleague, I am very happy that you indeed confronted the very bad weather. Just explained, my colleagues here, that I did not drive from Brussels to Leuven in a social, responsible manner, but I got here in time. And I'm very happy with the company of each of you, but the number of people do show that we are dealing with a subject that is not yet embedded in, let's say, everyday life of our cultural and economic society. CSR, corporate social responsibility. Let me start my expose with two anecdotes, which try to, let's say, introduce the subject. When I was first confronted with the term corporate governance, which was, I'm getting an old lady, back in '87, I didn't know what it was. It came from over the ocean. And my first reaction at that time was always, well, why do we need corporate governance? Is it not just normal that rules of good governance should be part of any company as such? Do we need specific rules to organize a good corporate governance? Why do we need separate codes on this? Codes that and governance that have created, we all know that, and my colleague, Professor Vanberg is making reference to that in the article that I read from him in preparation of this evening, a notion that has created a consulting industry on corporate governance all over the world at sometimes really exuberant price. I can tell you, if you want advice about corporate governance, it's a very costly affair. The second thing I've always wondered was, if we need corporate governance in separate codes, why do we only need it for listed companies? Why should we not have good governance in any company of the world, and even more? Why should we not have even more good governance in private companies? They probably need it more than listed companies. There's less transparency, there's no market for the shares, so maybe we need it even more there. However, I was young at that time, and very soon I have come to appreciate and understand the difference in approach on soft law and hard law, and the comply and explain approach. They do have merits. However, and you will have understood by now that I'm using the example of corporate governance for describing the risks that we surely will see coming back in corporate social responsibility, if you think of it from a corporate law point of view. There is, of course, the risk of a check-the-box formalistic approach. And the best example of that is probably that the queen of corporate governance in Belgian culture was Fortis. And Fortis is a bank that went down in a terrible manner in 2008. And whatever reason there were for Fortis going down, for Fortis collapsing, for Fortis failing utterly, there was never a court case, or maybe there will still come one, but there was never one until now, determining the causes for the collapse of Fortis. But I think we all know enough from the case to be quite certain when we say that bad governance had something to do with it. They nevertheless were the example of good corporate governance. Second, and I'm also certain that you will recognize that, corporate governance is often used as a marketing instrument. We are the king of corporate governance, we get medals, we get labels, and that's a selling instrument. We have good governance, so please pay a lot of money for our shares. Third element, what I've also learned, and what Europe has also learned in the meanwhile, because they've even made a recommendation on this, is all this comply and explain approach is very interesting, but apparently people are not very good in complying or explaining. Generally speaking, if you look at the quality of explaining in corporate reports and corporate governance, the explaining is very limited and very poor. Another element that is important to point out, and that again I consider as something that we need to keep an eye on when we talk about corporate social responsibility, is a very strong tendency emerging very soon of soft law being turned into hard law. And I can give you 3 examples, and all 3 of them, or at least 2 of the 3, are also relating to CSR. Gender diversity, remuneration of directors, and banking governance that has become entirely mandatory with CRD4, as you all know. Why is that? Why are we so bad at soft law combined with a system of comply or explain? Why do we not explain? Why do we need a legislator to intervene and to turn soft law into hard law? There can be several reasons for that, but apparently one of the reasons could be, or probably one of the reasons could be, is that self-regulation is not working. We do not have enough pressure from self-regulation. Best example in Belgium, remuneration of directors, and I'll enter into the CSR element of remuneration of directors in a few minutes, but in any event, remuneration in Belgium for listed companies was part of the corporate governance soft code, of the corporate governance code for a very long time, was changed several times, and then again the financial crisis broke out, and we all know what happened. Many high-placed bankers who performed very poorly in their bank took their goodbyes and were paid enormous amounts of money. And the public was so mad that the politicians saw no other solution than to quickly adopt a law regulating remuneration in listed companies. That, of course, raises an enormous issue, an issue that, again, will have its consequences for the approach of CSR. How credible is a soft law approach where a sector has to regulate itself? And I'll come back to that later. Second element that may be an explanation for the fact that soft law is not always working is the fact that it is not trusted by the legislator. And I think the good example there is gender diversity. The corporate governance code in Belgium had just begun, very late, I must admit, by promoting gender diversity. It was fresh in the code, and only 6 months later, even before the sector of the listed companies had had a chance to prove to the world that they were willing to take this seriously, the legislator intervened. Apparently, the legislator did not trust the sector to regulate itself in the field of gender diversity, and in view of recent events, I'm afraid that was a correct assessment on top of all things. By the way, when Belgium already in 2011 introduced mandatory gender diversity in boards of directors of listed companies and certain state-owned enterprises, and we are not very often, but in this case we were one of the first goers, one of the first movers in this field. I had the same problem. I commented this law a few times, and one of my questions is and remains until today: why only diversity? Mandatory diversity rules in listed companies. Why do we think that listed companies have a larger role to play here than privately owned companies? Is diversity not so important that it could as well play a role in private listed entities? And second remark, we all know that apparently one of the reasons why the soft law approach may not be working is that the legislator itself is not trusting the soft law approach. But then, of course, the legislator itself is not giving the best example, as we all know. It does not apply itself what it is preaching. Recent events in Belgium have indeed shown that even in the environment of public authorities, gender diversity is still an issue today. And again, let me not talk about this university either. We don't reach 20% of or not even 20% of our professorship are female, while more than 50%, even more than 55% of the students are female. We still have an issue. And those who know me a little bit better know that you shouldn't talk me about quota either, but that's another matter. Second anecdote, and I'm getting closer to the subject, but I think I've already introduced a few ideas for the debate that may be following on CSR. Second anecdote, there was a time when we had a lot of Chinese LLM students in this faculty. They disappeared as sudden as they came, and I don't know very well when exactly that was. As I said, I'm getting older, but it was a very nice young lady. I think I'm talking somewhere between 2005 and 2010, and she came to me because she wanted to make her master degree or LLM thesis on corporate social responsibility. So I took her through everything that existed on the subject in European context. I took her through everything that existed on the subject on the international context, and there were a lot of recommendations and literature around it, and she said, yes, all very interesting. But the whole year, the only thing she did was try to explain to me that corporate social responsibility in China meant, or means, I'm not sure whether things have developed since then, that it means that Chinese companies should simply comply with labor law, contract law, environmental law, and the like. And she said that is corporate social responsibility. So I tried to explain to her that maybe there was something more in CSR. And she said, no. Corporate social responsibility is Chinese companies having to comply with the law. Then I asked her, but don't they do that? And then the answer was, you can guess, well, no, of course they don't. So we should make them comply, and that is corporate social responsibility. What are companies? You can look at companies in very many different aspects, but I think we all agree when we say that companies are, in a way, organizational structures that are aiming at enhancing wealth. They are there to make people cooperate, and the idea is that everything or everybody involved in that cooperation should get out of the adventure richer than he was or she was before. Companies are organizational structures, organizational vehicles intended to create wealth. We had a thesis defense last Monday on this faculty on shareholders' agreements, and there the young doctor very strongly based his whole thesis on the idea shareholders only have one aim in life, and companies should fulfill that aim, create wealth for such shareholders. That's the first question. Should a company only create wealth for its shareholders, or also for other stakeholders? And most of you in this room are Belgians, and you know that we have this eternal debate in Belgium on the concept of the interest of a company. Is the interest of company the interest of the shareholders, the present and the future shareholders only, or should we broaden the scope to other stakeholders? Should we consider, for example, the directors? Probably yes. Should we consider other stakeholders, such as employees, such as suppliers, such as public authorities, and such as the society at large? And this discussion has been going on. For some authors, it has been decided by the Court of Cassation in a court case of 2014, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure that I can read that case by saying that in Belgium, the interest of a company is limited to the short time or to the short and middle term interest of present and future shareholders, but that's a first important notion. What is the interest of the company? But even, and you see that my notes are very CSR, I'm recycling my paper. Even if the aim of a company is providing a structure for creating wealth to its shareholders, and only to its shareholders, even then, there is inevitably an element of sustainability in it. What I mean by that is, it is of course great, and we know that some people on this earth do have that desire to become extremely rich and extremely wealthy and have all the money of the world. We even know that that tendency is even more present in these times than it was, let's say, 20 years ago. Wealth is getting more concentrated in the hands of a few, more than ever in the last 50 years. But of course, if at the end you are very rich and very wealthy, but there's no planet left, the planet is destroyed, there's no air, there's no water, there's pollution everywhere, there's people no longer be able to reproduce. Many of you may have looked at or may have watched the first season of The Handmaid's Tale. What's the worth of all this wealth? You can be as rich as the sea, but if there's no longer a sea, or vice versa, if there's sea everywhere, what can you do with all that wealth? So for me, wealth has inevitably a link to sustainability. The wealth must continue, not only for a few, but for everybody, but even for those few, even for those very little persons or limited number of people that get extremely wealth, their wealth disappears in 1 second if we no longer have a planet. So yes, I think it can be argued that there is a structural, natural, defendable link between doing business and doing so in a socially responsible manner. I think you cannot deny that. Huh? It nevertheless remains a difficult legal question, and I don't think that the question has been debated much in Belgian literature until now. It surely has been debated in international literature. So we should keep thinking about this, about supporting this link, about making it stronger. But again, I will come back with a few anecdotes at the end of my presentation to show you that we're not there yet. Let me then say you a few words about the legal framework of corporate social responsibility in Belgium. You will tell me, is there one? Yes, there is one. There is one. Not always directly, sometimes indirectly, but since 2016 there is even a direct legal framework. And probably for many of you, even those who are quite familiar with corporate law, it may come as a surprise, but it was imposed by a European directive. You may, or you may not know, you probably do know it, that all Belgian listed companies, and there we go again, only listed companies, in the framework of reporting on their corporate governance, are obliged to report on diversity in their board. There is a legal obligation in Belgium for boards of listed companies to be gender diverse, meaning that, and the legislation has entered into force last year. I will not tell you the tricks that some companies have used to still postpone that obligation. Some of them are really hilarious. But there is a legal obligation to have at least 1/3 of the board being another gender than the other 2/3. Read, there is a real, or understand, there is a legal obligation to have 1/3 women in boards of listed companies. So the company has to report on diversity in its board, the case being in its supervisory board, but you know that we don't have many companies with a dual system in Belgium, and also, and that's interesting, in their higher management. While, from a legal point of view, there is no obligation under Belgian law to have diversity in higher management. I think it would be a good idea if we have a legal obligation to have one there, but it does not exist. You should report on what your policy is. You should report on what your policy is aiming at. You should report on how it is implemented, and you should report on the results. You should also explain that if you do not have a policy, why you do not have a policy. And I sometimes take the trouble to go and have a look at reports of companies to see what they do with diversity. And there's one company that simply said, we don't need women. That was the reporting. We don't need them. Do remark, however, that the word diversity is even not defined in the law. There's no definition. And I am the first one to say that there's not only the issue of gender diversity, there's also the issue of, for example, race diversity. And we're not doing very well in this respect in this country, nor in this university, by the way, either. Belgian listed companies also have to report on remuneration. Well, remuneration, you could think of that as an element of corporate social responsibility, but that's not the approach taken by the Belgian law. The approach is simply be transparent to your shareholders, say on pay, and make a link between performance and pay, no reward for failure. There's no element whatsoever on social justice. For example, on the salary gap. How much does the CEO earn and how much is the lowest income in the company? Nothing about that. Then we have the public interest entities. Listed companies, shares or bonds, banks and insurance undertakings. Of a certain size and with at least 500 employees, only the big guys. They have, since 2017, and so we had the first reports in 2018, it's too early to say something sensible about it, but they have to report on the effects or the impact of their activity on the social matters, personnel, environmental matters, respect for human rights, and the battle against corruption and bribery. Which policies are into place? Which precautionary measures are taken to avoid any negative effects? What are the results of these policies? What are the risks, and how is the company dealing with these risks in their business relationships, in their products, and in their services? And which non-financial performance indicators are being used to assess the performance of the company? For doing so, the company has to use European and internationally recognized reference models. And again, if there's no policy on all this, you should explain why that is the case. And you have to make an explicit link to the figures in your annual accounts. In very exceptional circumstances, if reporting on your CSR, because that's what it's about, is risking to harm the company, you can keep silent. We have the first reports there. There has not yet been made an overall analysis of it. And let's say that the first reports on the matter are very cautious, to say it friendly. And then we have a last part, ladies and gentlemen, and I will be short because I've been indicated I should end. I'm at my last page, don't worry. We also have the whole world of not-for-profit. We have them in companies, the benefit corporations, and we have them in the real associations, those that are really not-for-profit, that don't distribute profits to their shareholders. Let me say 2 words of that sector. What bothers me in that sector is their self-labeling. They simply say, we are corporate social responsibility, and we are so because we say so that we are. We are trying to do something about that in the new legislation, because that's really a very bad idea, that is label yourself as being the corporate social responsible enterprise in this world. There are, of course, many private initiatives, there are many fault, and there are many traps with corporate social responsibility in this framework. I know of too many cases where CSR is used as a marketing instrument or as a recruitment instrument. But apart from, again, only listed companies, and that remains a surprise to me that I cannot explain, there's no legal obligation for Belgian companies to either do something about CSR or to mention something about CSR. So it's their own choice. And I will end by telling you something about my own experience, because what some of you may not know is that as a partner in Jubilius, I am, and I have been for a very long time, I've now passed the candle because I'm getting to my age limit in my firm and I want to pass on the candle timely. I was responsible for corporate social responsibility, and we even made a report on it that got a prize from the United Nations, because there are not many law firms that are trying to do something serious about corporate social responsibility. I'm proud on this, but at the same time, I'm still very skeptical. Because let me just say you 2 things. If a law firm is saying from itself that it is behaving socially responsible, should it, for example, do advisory work for those that produce weapons? Should it do advisory work for those that pollute this world? Should it, for example, do advisory work for Ryanair, which is, I think, the best example of creating wealth for one single person at the expense of many other persons? I've decided more than 10 years ago I was never going to fly with Ryanair again. Not because of the bad experience, but because I realized very quickly that I was flying cheaply, but somebody else was paying it. And you know who's paying it, it's the personnel that is paying it, and the environment, but that's the case for all aviation. So it's a difficult issue. And as long as I talk to my partners about CSR, on being careful with paper, with printing, having the water in glass bottles, having local food, having local soup, having local fruit in the kitchen, they're fine with it. But if I should start talking about, should we still work for example, a weapon producer? Should we still work for a very high polluting firm that is not doing anything about it? Then they prefer to tell me Wyckaert, shut up. Last example. My sister is working for a very large international player who is very proud about its CSR. So my sister is driving a hybrid car paid by the company. But you know what? And all her colleagues are doing the same. Beautiful big cars, you should see them. I drive a very small car because it's very hard to park in Brussels, but they all have these beautiful big cars, all hybrid. You know something? When she would fill it with gas, with fuel, her company pays for it. If she fills it with electricity, she has to pay for it herself, because the company will not support that. So far, so good for corporate social responsibility in a very big international player. Thank you. I hope I have given you some food for thought.
I'm happy to give the floor to Professor Vanberg for his opening statement.
Is it working? Does it work? Talk a little so
Yeah.
we can test.
Does it work? It works. Okay. Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to participate in this discussion. My presentation will come from a very different perspective. It's a perspective of constitutional economics, and what this means I will explain in a minute. So it will be a very general perspective on the issue, and the discussion will provide, I hope, an opportunity to go into the more specific issues that you raised. I will structure my talk in these 6 subtitles. I will first say a little bit about what the issue is from my perspective, and you already addressed it before. Then I explain the particular perspective I bring to this issue, and then I talk about particular way of interpreting what a market economy is about. And within the market economy, corporations play a particular role, and CSR is, of course, particularly focused on the role of corporations. I will say a little bit about the corporation. Then I will finally come to the CSR more specifically and talk about some varieties of corporate social responsibility, and will conclude with a few remarks. Now, the discussion on corporate social responsibility was very much centered around, for a long time, a provocative statement by the economist Milton Friedman, who said, in a market economy, the responsibility of corporations is to make profits, but with a qualification, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. Now, the question of CSR is this a sufficient description of the responsibility of corporations within the market economy, or should they have responsibilities that go beyond and may even conflict with their goal to earn profits? Now, I will approach this subject, as I said before, from the perspective of constitutional economics. Economics is a field with different kinds of approaches. Constitutional economics specifically focuses on the relation between the framework of rules within which economic processes operate and the effects rules have on the way economies work and on the interrelation. What happens if you change certain rules? How does the rule framework and the way it is designed affect the processes that go on within these, under these rules? And constitutional economics emphasizes that as socially organized people, we can choose to a significant extent the rules under which we live. And so in the analysis, we make the distinction between different levels of choice. Most generally, the level of choice of rules and the level of choices within rules. And since this can be very easily explained and illustrated in terms of the game metaphor plays a central role in constitutional economics. And here we can distinguish now between three basic issues, and this will be relevant when I come to the CSR issue. On the one hand, the question is, what type of game do we want to play? Say in sports, group of people come together, do we want to play football, soccer, or handball, or whatever? Once we decide what game to play, we can decide, what specific rules do we want to apply for our playing the game. And once we have decided on the rules, then comes the playing of the game. And the relevant distinction that I want to emphasize here is the different kinds of interests that prevail at the various levels. In playing the game, the individual player's perspective is, of course, to play the game successfully within the rules. And these interests, they can, of course, easily get into conflict. Two teams that play soccer, they have conflicting interests in their respective interests in playing the game successfully gets them into conflicts of interest. When it comes to deciding on the rules of the game, this changes. There can well be a common interest, all share in modifying the rules in order to be able to play a better game, better in terms of the joint evaluations. Now, let's look at the market economy from this game perspective. Friedrich Hayek, a famous classical liberal economist, has proposed that we should call the market economy the game of catalaxy. Catalaxy from the classical Greeks, katalatein, exchange. He says basically what is the market economy is about. The market economy is an institutional legal framework for people to exchange with each other. And this framework is mainly responsible to assure that transactions are voluntary, that fraud and coercion are, as far as this is humanly possible, should be excluded, so that those transactions that take place are voluntarily agreed upon by all participants. This is the ideal of the functioning of a market economy. The reality does never get really close or extremely close to this ideal, but this is what, when we decide to play the market game, what the legal institutions and the enforcing institutions are supposed to assure. And in terms of the first question that I mentioned before, what kind of game do we play, want to play, Hayek's argument is people have good reasons to decide to play this game in comparison to potential alternative games. Now, basically, for a long time, the most important alternative game was centrally planned economy. And historical evidence has amply shown that this was not by far not as an attractive game, economic game for people to play than the market game. But the basic decision to play the market game does not decide yet according to which kind of rules do we want to play this game, and how the game will actually take place and will be played out in practice will depend on the rules that are framing this game. As Hayek has put it, how well the market will function depends on the character of the particular rules. And rules can be, as even contemporary comparisons between different market economies show, can be very different. And the CSR issue is in part about what should the rules be according to which we play the market game. Now, as individuals, we participate, even if we are not always conscious of this, in two capacities. On the one hand, we are all consumers. Excuse me. And the classical founder of modern economics and also the founder of the theory of how markets work, Adam Smith, he famously said, and I translate what he said in the terms that are applicable here, the market game is basically a game that is played for the benefit of the consumer. So we don't produce in order to produce, we produce in order to consume. So consumption is the purpose of the exercise. And if this is so, the exercise, the game should be structured in a way that it works to the benefit of the consumer and not to the benefit of the producers, or as he called them in his time, the merchants. So he was critical of the system that was called mercantilism, a system that he criticized is, to a large extent, characterized by rules that benefit producers, import subsidies, import restrictions, export subsidies, and other provisions that benefit producers, increase the income of producers, but hurt consumers because they increase the prices that consumers have to pay for the goods they are demanding. And so his argument was, in order for the system to work to the benefit of the consumer, it should assure that producers are under competition. So it always, the main aim of the system is to assure competition among producers. Now, this is how we participate in the market game, as I said, as consumers and as producers. Now, in what way are we participating as producers? Now, as employees in a company, we are on the producer side. On the producer side, we may be interested in import restrictions for the type of products that our company is producing, because this makes our income, protects our income. So we have different interests, and basically one can say that playing a social market, the market game, is a compact that we make among each other, a kind of social contract that we say, okay, in our capacity as producers, we are willing to submit to the unpleasantness of competition in order for us all to be able to benefit as consumers. Now, but this is not the most important aspect that I wanted to emphasize here. The distinction I wanted to focus more on is we are, on the one side, participants in the market, but we are, on the other side, citizens, members of the political community in which we live. And the political community is the entity in charge of defining and enforcing the rules under which the market game is played. So as participants in the market, we pursue our interests as consumers and producers as citizens members, we have a joint interest, or should have a joint interest, in coming together and defining the rules so that the game is as pleasant for all of us as is possible. So, as players in the market game, our primary responsibility is to seek success in this game within the rules of the game, to play the game fairly. In our capacities as citizens, we have a joint responsibility for defining and enforcing suitable rules of the market game. Suitable means rules that make the market system works in a way that is desirable for all of us. Now to the role of corporations. If you would imagine a market game, an exchange and competition game, only played by individuals, where we as individuals are producers, produce things that we offer to others in order for them to get from them what we want to get. This is what the exchange game is about. In an exchange game, everyone can only hope to get from others what he or she wants by offering to others what they want. Now, if this market game would be only played by individuals, it would be somehow strange if we would call on individuals to not to seek to play this game successfully, but to, say, comply with demands that detract from their ability to play the game successfully. So, for instance, to go to the sports example, say, everyone would say, by now they do it by themselves, but I was thinking in previous years, Bayern München was so dominant in the German Bundesliga that people got worried that the whole season may become boring because it is already predetermined who will be at the end on the top. Now, in this situation, one could have told Bayern München, now see, you have a social responsibility to keep the interest in the league. So please, play a little bit more moderate. Don't try always to win. Now, it would be implausible to raise such demands. If there is something in the game that makes the whole game less attractive than it should be, than it could be, then there would be a reason to think about what should we change in the rules, but not to ask people to change their behavior so that they will be less successful. In effect, such a demand would be perverse. Why? Those who would be most receptive for such moral demands would be the least successful in the market game. They would be weeded out, and those would have a better chance of survival and being survive, who turn a deaf ear to such demands. So, through individual morality to try to solve problems that are inherent in the system cannot work in a competitive game. Now, question is, does this change if the players in the market game are not just human individuals, but large corporations? And this is the issue that you addressed before. Now, and you talked about corporations as systems of organized cooperation to create wealth. In economics, we have a term, team production, which means that there is several individuals, group of individuals, that work together in an organized manner to produce something. Now, the organized cooperation requires that there is a constitution, a corporate constitution. There must be some rules for organizing this cooperation, this team production. And in this context, a difference that is in particular often referred to in debates on corporate social responsibility is between types of participants, in particular shareholders and stakeholders. Now, basically, a corporation, an entity, an organization that operates within a market economy is under competitive pressure. Success cannot be guaranteed. Success depends on the ability of this team to produce things, to offer something for which others are willing to pay, and willing to pay enough in order to compensate all those who participate in the team for their contribution, and then something being left for the person or the persons who basically take responsibility for the success of the entity. Now, this is expressed in a little bit complicated manner. Let me say it a little bit differently. In such a team, there must be at least one person who promises the other participants, I will pay you at the end of the period a certain amount, no matter what the revenue is that we will earn through our team efforts. So I guarantee you that you will be paid. These are the recipients of contractual income, typically the employees and maybe others. There's people contributed capital with the guaranteed interest. So everybody who gets a guaranteed return for his or her participation in the team. The person or the persons who make this promise, they are dependent on whether the revenue that is earned from whatever the team produces and the payments that they have promised, whether there is a difference left. And the difference would be profit. Profit is nothing other than the difference between revenue earned and the cost incurred in producing what is offered at the market. If the revenue doesn't cover the expenses promised, then the recipient of this residual income incurs a loss. So, in other terms, the shareholders are the recipients of residual income. And that this income is positive depends on the company making a profit. That revenue exceeds costs. So the constitution of the corporation, the rules according to which the team production is organized, specifies who is recipient of contractual income and who is recipient of residual income. Then there are other stakeholders. In CSR debates, suppliers, the customers are called stakeholders. But they are in a totally different relation to the company. They are in a market relation, an exchange relation. And their relation will be covered or will be controlled by the competition that is exercised, that prevails in the respective markets, the supply markets and the sales markets of the company. And finally, the CSR debates, the community is often referred to, the political community, as a stakeholder. And certainly there is a relation between the corporation and the community, first in the sense of being obliged to follow the rules, to play fairly, and on the other side, certainly the importance of keeping goodwill with the political community. Now, what remains, and I already indicated this, is that profit is the indicator of successful operation of the corporation within the market game. Profit, again, is nothing other than the difference between revenue and costs, payments to the recipients of contractual incomes, to suppliers, etc. Now, the way the corporate constitution, the rules for how this team production is organized, how this specifies how the, say, employees are compensated, under what terms they can work, and so on. The terms of this constitution will in the end be subject to the competition that the corporation operates in within the market context. So it will be tested by the market. The example that Professor Wyckaert mentioned earlier of this Belgian company that ranked very high on the CSR indicator but went bankrupt is an example that for the fact that the internal way of structuring the corporation is relevant for the success or failure in the market competition that the company is exposed to. One could, of course, ask the company to be socially responsible in the sense of, in bad times, not to dismiss their employees. Now, if this in the end means not to dismiss a certain number of employees, not to dismiss anybody, if this in the end means that the whole company goes bankrupt, then this is an advice that doesn't make much sense within a competition game. So the competition always operates as constraints on what competitors in the market game can do, and this always operates as a constraint on the kind of corporate constitution that a corporation can adopt. Now to the varieties of corporate social responsibility, and after having provided the framework, I can go through this relatively quickly. There is first the soft version that Professor Wyckaert mentioned earlier when she referred to the CSR industry. The soft version is the version that emphasizes corporate social responsibility is good business. Now, what is typically contrasted there is short-term profit-seeking, or one could also say imprudent profit-seeking, and wise or longer-term profit-seeking. Now, the market game with its competitive pressure basically exerts constantly pressure on corporations to operate prudently, to operate with a short-term profit orientation, which undermines longer-term success in the market game, is certainly not a very successful, a very useful business strategy. So you would expect that market competition will encourage what the soft version of corporate social responsibility demands. So corporate social responsibility advisors basically would then fall into the category of business advisors of the general sort, just specialized on certain aspects, and the wisdom of their advice would be tested in the fact whether or not the companies they advise so are more successful in the market competition game than others who do not. Then there is the hard version. The hard version demands that corporations act in ways that decrease their capacity to earn profits given the rules of the game as they are. They require, in effect, corporations to honor rules that go beyond the given formal and informal rules of the game. Now here applies what I said earlier. If you, in a competitive game, and corporations are in a market economy in a competitive game, they have to earn profits in order to be able to cover the costs they incur. If you recommend or demand that companies do things that impede their capacity to earn profits, what will happen? Those corporations or the managers or directors of these corporations who are more receptive to such appeals, they will be less successful than corporations who are not responsive to such demands. And as the market competition works, the competition game of the market works, that is, in the end, in the longer run, the less receptive corporations will will dominate over the receptive ones. So it will induce a perverse selection process. So this cannot actually be a successful way of achieving any goals that are considered socially desirable. What would be required would be an explicit discussion about whether these demands or these CSR requirements, whether if they are generally followed, would make for a better game. So that would be a case for a legislative discourse on should we, considering the predictable effects of a general practice of this sort, would this make the market game better? Now, there are, of course, say, normative requirements that are not codified in law that nevertheless decent players in the economic game honor. These are general informal rules that are considered to be a part of doing proper business. And corporations that do not comply, they get a bad reputation. So if there are general consensus, then the informal sanctions that are exercised in order to enforce such informal rules, they may be sufficient. If there should be an erosion that they cannot be successfully enforced in this way, then again, the legislative route should be taken and an explicit discussion on whether the, I can jump over this, whether the rules should be formally changed. Then finally, the hard version. The hard version is about the rule constraints under which corporations should, it's not, excuse me, the radical version, while the hard version is about what should the rules be. The hard version is in effect about whether we should play the market game at all. The hard version would be, say, banning profit-seeking generally as something that corporations should pursue. And since profits is the essence, profit-seeking is the essence of playing the market game, such demands basically are demands to play a different game. And of course, in a political community, such demands may be voiced, and people can discuss whether they want to play a different game than the market game, but this discussion should be explicitly engaged in and not, say, covered, under the cover of the CSR label. Okay, so my conclusion, going back to the three levels that I distinguish between the decision to play a particular type of game, the decision under what kind of rules to play the game, and the playing of the game. The soft version is basically about how to play the market game, and it's basically an advice to play the market game prudently. The hard version is about under what kind of rules should we play the game? Should we, in addition to the existing legal and commonly shared informal requirements, impose additional requirements? And finally, the radical version is about what kind of game should we play? Should we play the market game or some different kind of economic game? So thank you very much.
Thank you. We now have a reply by Professor Wyckaert, then a reply by Professor Vanberg, and then we will have a discussion.
This works? Yeah, also for you? Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and I'm always pleasantly surprised to see how these, how should I call them, rules of law and economics can be bent in very different directions to hopefully direct human behavior. And it's a very beautiful, how should I say, and a very convincing catalog of how human behavior should work. I'm not sure that I'm convinced that we can trust human behavior. Not at an individual level, and maybe even less so at a collective level. So that's a question I'm raising. Are we sufficiently to be trusted as an individual or as a collective community? And the second question I was asking myself when listening to your expose was, well, okay, in the end, who is determining the game? Who is determining the rules of the game? And who will be determining the margin in which it is allowed to change those rules? Because if we start change the rules of the football game, in the end, the game will no longer be football, but will be a different game. And then one of the major questions probably in CSR is, can we entrust companies with this task? Can we entrust companies with the duty to determine the game, the rules of the game, and the margin in which the game can be played and the rules can be changed? Or is this the task of somebody who is legislating? Is this a legislator's task? And then you can take it even a step further to make it even more complicated and more difficult. Which legislator? The ones we like, the ones that has been democratically chosen and looks for a common denominator in society, or an autocratic legislator who determines in his own wisdom what is best for society. And why am I saying that? Because I've read recently that proportionally seen, the Chinese have made much more progress in fighting pollution than the Western world has, because there's one legislator making the rules of the game. Can we rely, can we trust self-regulating of companies? Can we really believe now that companies will, how should I say, incorporate societal elements in the way they think, the way they behave, or will that remain in the outside circle? Will CSR be something that they will be willing to take along as soon as and to the extent that their hardcore business has been complied with? I sometimes have the impression that CSR only is present in companies' behavior when they're at ease with all the other elements of their, let's say, human existence as companies. Once you have the profit, once you have the production, once you have the dividend, once you have your people at ease, once you have the profits of the year, maybe then, after all these conditions have been met, we can think a little bit about corporate social responsibility. And that's probably not the way we're going to get there. I'm not sure I'm pleading for either individual behavior or for collective and in the end behavior or legislative intervention. I don't know yet. I don't know yet. What I do know for certain, and then it gets very personal, that in any event, all of us will need to take our own responsibility as an individual in the very first place. I should not be driving a big car eating gas if I do not need to carry around 10 children. And I do not need to carry around 10 children, so I have a small car. I should not, to give another example, waste plastic bottles if I can as well, and I do use it if I can as well use a can. And these are only very small elements, but I think we should in any event start there with our own individual responsibility. And I also tend to believe, but I'm not certain of that the aggregated weight of individual convictions will in the end determine the collective responsibility. So I don't think we should shift the beginning of corporate social responsibility to the collective and to the corporation. I think we should start with ourselves in any event. But I do admit that I am skeptical about the capability of each of us to assume our individual responsibility and to do it fast enough in the times you are living in to indeed do something serious about the future of this planet. Because I think certainly the last 10 years we are at a turning point and we may be missing the chance to stop the turning. So in the end, yes, probably we should get some help from our good friend the legislator, or at least some pressure, or at least some means to convince ourselves to, and ourselves are us as individuals and us as corporations. I do think that you can take that in very different routes. I think a lot can still be done with, for example, tax advantages. It's not something that you have considered, it's not something that I have mentioned, but I'm sure that there is still room, there is a lot of wealth concentrated in the hands of few people. They do not like to pay taxes. Well, I would prefer them not to have to pay taxes if they do certain things that are to the benefit of the entire society, instead of trying to hide in Luxembourg or other, well, no longer Luxembourg, but the Bahamas or other tax paradises, not to pay taxes. I also tend to think that we will not be able to avoid to make harder rules. So that's again the legislator that needs to intervene. For example, on environmental matters. We are not paying for the pollution that we are creating for transport. Not with cars, not with aviation. And I tend to think that their companies on their own will not get there. I think we need a legislator to intervene. And I think we need to accept that we should, as an individual and as a corporation, be willing to pay for the real costs that we are causing. So, yes, CSR should be more than the little leaf to cover one's nakedness. Because too often, I think CSR today is still that. And I also am very much suspicious of CSR consultancy, but I think you share my thoughts there, if I understood properly what you were saying. CSR is more than consultants trying to make a lot of money out of CSR. So if I try to make some sense of thoughts that are going in many different directions, I hesitate, I do hesitate, but I do think that we should speed up. And I do not believe that the market rules and the market rules only will be sufficient to make us speed up. I am very much convinced that we need the individual to take his responsibility, but there again, I'm not convinced that we will be fast enough with many enough to weigh on the collective responsibility. So I think in the end, yes, I make a call towards harder law to enhance social responsibility as a compulsory element of determining the legal circle of the duties of corporations.
Thank you. I think the organizers, I think the organizers have built Professor Wyckaert as an a proponent of corporate social responsibility, and Professor Vanberg as an opponent. But when I hear Professor Wyckaert, she doesn't trust corporations to do the right thing by themselves, and she wants hard rules, not the soft rules of corporate social responsibility, and she stresses that the change has to come from the behavior of individuals. That have the impression that Professor Wyckaert is perhaps an opponent of corporate social responsibility. And on the other hand, I heard Professor Vanberg stress the importance of informal rules of good and decent conduct. And then perhaps I had the impression that you are perhaps a tree-hugging proponent of corporate social responsibility. Or did I understand that in an incorrect way?
Let me clarify. First of all, on the political system, you addressed this at your beginning after talking about authoritarian system. I presume we are talking about a democratic society. Now, in a democratic society, we are all equal participants in the political process. So we all share the responsibility for what the rules in the system are in which we live. We delegate the practical exercise of our responsibility to delegates, but this doesn't change the fact that we all are equally sharing in the responsibility of what happens in our political community. Now, I fully agree with Professor Wyckaert that, for instance, with regard to environmental problems, we should start with our individual responsibility in behaving responsibly with regard to the problems that are clearly identified. And we should welcome public campaigns to encourage such individual responsibility. However, and I'm skeptical whether campaigning at this level will be a sufficient strategy for coping with the problems we are actually facing, then we have to get up to the next level, which is the norms of decent, the informal norms of decent behavior. It's not just a matter of whether I properly sort my waste, but whether I display behavior that is socially approved and misbehavior is socially disapproved. So it's also important to keep up a social climate where these informal rules are sufficiently honored. Why? We don't want to live in a society in which everything that, say, we expect from proper behavior is regulated by formal legal rules and sanctioned by the formal apparatus. However, the first levels, this individual responsible behavior and compliance with informal rules of decent behavior at the individual level and the corporate level, can only function if the level of formal rules that are effectively enforced is sufficiently sufficient to provide, say, to the basic functioning. So I think in all those cases where we identify problems that are not cured by this individual responsible behavior and are not controlled sufficiently by informal rules, we have to move up to the legislative level And this includes, while at the other levels, we don't have an explicit discourse about how do rules that we adopt affect the working of the game at the legislative level. There comes the hour of truth. We cannot only adopt because we have a good feeling this or this should be done generally. We could not blindly adopt such a rule and make it a law. At that level, we must engage in a responsible discussion on if that is made effectively a general rule enforced for all, does it make the game better? So this much on, now on China. I said I'm starting from the assumption that we are talking about a democratic system. Now, excuse me. Our democratic systems, as we can amply observe, are not functioning perfectly. And there are many defects in these systems, and one system is the receptiveness to interest group pressure. Now, this introduces, of course, again, special problems that we have with corporations, because at that level, corporations are more effective than ordinary citizens. So in this regard, it's not astonishing that an authoritarian system like China, if it puts its mind to a particular task, can perform this task more efficiently, which does not mean that it is overall a more desirable system, but it points to the fact that our democratic systems are improvable, and we also have a responsibility of thinking about how to improve the democratic process. But this is a topic that goes clearly beyond our today's task. Finally, remark to some of the things you said. Your practical experience. Now, CSR has become a label that can, as you often stress, that can be instrumentally used. And it has to become a label under which demands can perhaps, or the advocates expect these demands can be more effectively pursued if they are sold under the CSR label. I honestly don't see what gender diversity has to do with corporate social responsibility, but certainly the corporate social responsibility is a politically effective instrument of selling it. So many things are discussed under this label, or political demands are raised under this level because it can be used. Now, the general problem that you emphasized very much, wealth creation versus sustainability. I think this is, in the end, and can only be approached by proper legislation, that constraints are imposed on corporate behavior that seek to ensure sustainability in the sense of survivability of our planet, to put it in dramatic terms. I don't think that by individual responsibility in your own private proper behavior, this can be done. I think that can only be approached in the through the legislative process.
Thank you. I think that I can say that both of you probably believe in hard rules. Would it be fair to say that you, Professor Vanberg, put the threshold for imposing hard rules somewhat higher than Professor Wyckaert? Is that a correct assessment of your respective positions?
I'm not sure. I think as long as it works, informal rules and personal responsibility are preferable. But as soon as we must come to the conclusion the problem that we mean needs to be solved is not sufficiently solved by these means, I think there is no way around than doing it in the legislative formal way.
I think the impression is that indeed that I'm a bit more
quicker in stating that we may need the intervention of the legislator is correct, and I think your answer is confirming that. However, I do not believe in the legislator intervening without the individual support. I truly do not think that if the legislator says you should no longer travel by plane in Europe, and the individuals are not willing to do that, then they will find a way around it. So I really do think we should start with our own responsibility, and I agree with you, to the extent we manage to handle things with our own responsibility, that's even better. To the extent that corporations manage to handle things within their own social responsibility, that would be ideal. And for the sake of the record, I am a very strong believer in democracy, be sure. But it's true that sometimes autocratic systems can organize things more efficiently than democratic systems, simply because the fact they don't need individual support, but just impose things. And then the question is, of course, in the long term, will that also be sustainable? Where we may differ, I think, is that even if I think I'm a bit younger than you are, and that may play in either direction, I'm a little bit more skeptical about the individual being able to develop behavior that will, in time, and let's put it in these dramatic terms, save our planet. I do believe that we are reacting very slowly. And sometimes, I'm 57 years old now, and sometimes I think, where was I the last 30 years? I mean, all this has happened and I didn't see it and I didn't intervene. So if I didn't do it, how should I expect so many other people of my age, older or younger, doing it in my stead, to speak of? And as an illustration, we had a very painful discussion this last year in Belgium about collecting plastic bottles. And it was very strange because you had very many different interests collapsing, and in one way or another we were not able to come to a compromise, even if the compromise was in fact lying at the table. We drink too much, and this should have been glass, or as I said, containers. Since 5 years, I've stopped buying plastic bottles, and it works. You can perfectly live without them. I only finish them when I get them at the table. But the you should. But there was clearly an individual movement in support of money to be paid for returning plastic bottles. That was the first layer. Certainly in Flanders, the part of this country where we live in, people generally were willing to accept that they could no longer throw these away, but should bring them back and pay some money for that. And then we had the corporations, and they almost all said, no, we don't want this. It's not the most efficient way to collect waste. It's going to be too costly, so it's not helping us with reaching our goals of profits. We have alternatives. We think you should still put it in a bag and use it as waste in a proper way. I mean, there were 10 reasons not to do it. And in the end, the political favor turned towards industry and said, okay, we're not going to do it. We're going to leave self-regulation until 2020. Is that the compromise they fell? Somewhere around that. And since then, I've been counting bottles and collecting them in my garden. And no, I've been collecting them for a very long time. I live on a street corner, and so I have a lot of waste in my garden. People throw away. I've started counting them. And if you start counting them, you don't understand how it's possible that the individual willingness to do it was not picked up by companies and was not picked up by the political level either. And that's a bit frightening. That's really very frightening. So, yes, I really think we need to speed up things, and we need to do it as an individual, but we also need to do it as a society. And after the experience I had with corporate governance as an advisor, I am often advising boards. I am I'm all for corporate social responsibility. I'm a little less convinced that we can trust companies in imposing it. Yes, I admit.
Just a quick response. I totally agree with your caveat that we shouldn't trust companies. You shouldn't trust any particular organization or institution which naturally pursues a particular interest. Mm-hmm. But not to take a different view from yours, but what you mentioned about the company's objection to this method of disposing with plastic bottles. I understand that they sought to engage in a factual debate about, here's a problem, what are more or less effective ways of dealing with this problem? And I think this debate should have been carried on in the legislative process and then make a decision informed about what are the factual expectable consequences if we do it this or that way. And I'm convinced that, for instance, in Germany, the current way we are doing it is certainly not the most effective way, but it's somehow demanded as, and once it is implemented and practiced, we could have an informed discussion about better ways of doing it. I think that should take place more than it does now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I fully agree with that.
Professor Wyckaert mentioned already the example of tax and tax evasion. If I am to believe our colleagues of tax law, which I'm leaving in the middle, whether or not I'm doing this, they say that the directors of a company have a fiduciary duty to evade taxes. They have a fiduciary duty to evade taxes. I don't know if all people are lawyers. I think most lawyers will be familiar with the concept of fiduciary duty. It's hard to define, but it struck me what it is I was listening on a discussion among persons in the management of a client, and one person said, but isn't what we're doing that we're not going to say something to a contract party? Isn't what we're doing unethical, like not telling what we're about to do? And then another director said, no, maybe, but we have a fiduciary duty towards our investors to do what seeks the most profit. And of course, it was a very, in the end, a very ethical. The other guys were the bad guys, to put it short. But it struck me that a fiduciary duty is to go in a single-minded way for one interest, whereas in other circumstances, the normal ethical way would be to balance those interests and to find the middle way. So our tax lawyers say, well, you have a fiduciary duty to evade taxes. And of course, the example, the answer you could give is, well, use the political process to impose rules which avoid the evading of taxes. But does that really work? Because it assumes one political community where you are an equal participant. But can we as Belgians, even if we as Belgian citizens would agree on a certain, what would be fair taxes, would we be able to impose it? We're living in a world where there is more and more forum shopping. And forum shopping, which allows you to choose the applicable law, well, it also takes away the possibility of a political community to put limits on the profit seeking. And then I have some sympathy with action groups that want to shame the Starbucks of this world into paying their taxes. Would you agree? Is that perhaps what you mean with upholding a certain ethos, ethical standards, those informal rules of good and decent behavior?
No. If there are loopholes in the tax code that allow companies to evade taxes, then there is a conflict between the pursuit of the interests of the company to be successful in the market game and the fulfilling of an ethical demand. But, as I said before, if this problem that exists because there are loopholes in the tax code, that is a system problem. And system problems cannot be solved by individual ethics, not by business ethics. So there remains the responsibility of the legislator to close these loopholes. You also addressed another problem, that in a mobile world where companies can choose their location, the location where they pay taxes, then the possibility of national governments to enforce, say, tax laws that their constituency would consider the proper laws is limited. But this again shows that, first of all, there are problems of finding international agreements that, and there should be possibility, I think, finding agreement on may be difficult. And on the other hand, there's a thing, I'm not an expert in tax law, but it's also a reason to think about what are adequate taxation principles. If, say, it is allowed for companies to decide in which jurisdiction to declare their accounting profit, independent upon where they operate. Starbucks has all its shops all over Germany and has an accounting office in Ireland, I'm not sure, but in Ireland. Then this is a stupid way of raising taxes. There should be a different way. The possibility of a national government to decide, or a national legislature to decide this unilaterally, but basically what I'm saying, all these things point to me to typical systems problems, and to come with CSR and appeals to companies to behave ethically. You can do this, but this is not the effective way of solving systems problems.
I'm a bit surprised, but also very happy to hear that a call for CSR also leads for a call for a better Europe, and probably also for a call for a better United Nations and any other international cooperation we can think of. And that brings me back to something else you said, and something in which I would very gratefully want to believe, but I'm not sure whether this, let's say, hypothesis is today fulfilled. That is the fact that we are all equal participants in society. I wish we were. I'm not sure we are. And if we should strive for something as an individual, is to see to it that not only you, me, and Professor Vananroye here in the middle are equal participants in society, but that also those next to us who are weaker and less well-born and less intelligent and less healthy and less wealthy than we are, get all their chances of equally participating in society. I find the statement that tax evasion is a fiduciary duty as a corporate lawyer, I find that a very strange statement. And I don't think I tend to agree with it. And I think the distinction you made about loopholes in the tax legislation that should be closed by the legislator, I do agree. But even if they exist, I'm not sure it's the corporate duty of a corporate officer to look for them and actively use them. I do not think that that is acceptable. Yes, they should be closed for sure, but we should not actively seek them. It's the same with the example of Ryanair I used, who is actively seeking and using the loopholes in social protection. But always, there ain't such a thing as a free lunch. Somebody is paying somehow. And that's probably what we should try to avoid. We should try to see to it that the payments are equally spread, not only in our own little national society, but throughout the world. And again, as I said, I strongly believe that you should start with yourself as an individual. But I do not believe that, generally speaking, we will be able to manage solely acting as individuals. And again, my trust in corporations here is more limited than it maybe should be.
Would you agree that a board of directors has two options on the table? Option A is the plain vanilla tax regime, which results in a high tax. And option B is that they set up a very complicated structure, which is perfectly in accordance with the law. That's our understanding. But it's very artificially elaborate. A lot of advisors have earned fees on it. And that second option is, of course, gives a much lower tax bill. That a board of directors, they will rarely say it so, but let's assume for the purpose of the discussion that the board of directors says, well, look, we looked at option A, we looked at option B. Option B is obviously much more profitable for the shareholders, but for corporates, no, we don't mention it because we think that's the good thing to do. We'll go for option A.
Yeah, just briefly, I would hope that there exist media inquiring journalists who expose such practice in public, and that the reputation effect will be a deterrent. So ideally, my world would be one where such possibilities, legal possibilities of evasion, do not exist. On the other hand, no law can be perfect. So in the sense, we speak of the spirit of the law. So if people behave towards the law in the sense of exploiting every margin where they can deviate, then a legal system cannot work. So in this sense, we can never have a perfect tax system. So this is where informal sanctions must come in and maintain a certain spirit of playing fairly by the rules. And with regard to corporations, I think the public media have a role to play in exposing such practices, and if that is then, say, something that damages their reputation in the public, that should be a deterrent too. So just as in private conduct, informal sanctions keep us in line, corporations should be kept in line by making practices public that the people don't approve of, even if the law allows for them.
But is it the fact that in the past decades, since the 80s, and probably it's less so than before, that the idea was, well, shareholder value is a kind of predominant value. It's not against the laws, so that shareholder value should prevail, and there's no reason to shame the company into going for the other direction. Yeah, okay. So I think that it's those rules of good and decent conduct that differentiate you from other I would say opponents of CSR. I would also assume then that you would agree that a board of directors, even if the laws are not enforced, a board of directors should preferably comply with them.
But it's always good if those who have to make such decisions have in mind that there will be bad consequences if they don't behave properly. If they operate in an environment where they truly believe and have reasons to believe, it doesn't make a difference whether we make use of these opportunities or not. I think then things are not in good shape, so to speak. So in this sense, I don't trust people in the sense that out of an internal ethics, independent of whatever happens, this may work for some people some of the time, but if there are not bad consequences following bad behavior, every ethic that might have existed will erode over time. So we have to make sure that bad consequences follow, either bad legal consequences or bad informal reputation consequences.
Yeah. Question to Professor Wyckaert. Isn't it true in practice I've often seen that if the minutes of the board of directors start to talk in an elaborate way about the corporate interests, and if they mention really other constituencies such as the employees or the environment or the employment, then it's probably a sign often there's something wrong. Either they're like impinging on the rights of minority shareholders or on the rights of creditors. It doesn't shareholder value have the benefit of really setting a very clear standard. You can hold directors easily responsible or liable. And if you make this more diffuse, if you bring in the interests of all other different types of constituencies, don't you allow directors to engage in self-serving interest under the guise of a nice, fluffy, broad corporate interest?
That brings us to the very difficult discussion about what is corporate interest, and a discussion that's been going on in Belgium that's not settled yet. It's a little bit like, well, let's say the discussion we also have about a company with capital or without capital. Isn't it easier to have very mathematical rules on distribution instead of giving some assessment to the board of directors whether or not the company can distribute dividends? But that's another matter. I'm not sure that I agree with the, let's say, the axioma that the only, and I think I made that very clear in my presentation, the axioma that shareholders' wealth is the only determining force in the life of a company, because in the long run it will not be sustainable and all that wealth will be gone in any event if we go on like this. Shareholders' wealth has been at the basis of building out financial markets in Europe. Europe was jealous of the mettle of the United States, and so brought shareholders' value in the center of our core values for developing companies. Well, we all know where it has brought us. We were struck by the financial crisis as a crisis of greed, and we're still suffering from it. We all are paying for the consequences of Dexia, for example, and we still will be for 3 or 4 generations to come. So yes, shareholders' wealth and value is important, but it's not the end of the story, I think. I do agree with you that corporate interest is one of the most used and abused notions, and it's very difficult to define it. I'm not necessarily agreeing with you that as soon as you mention the corporate interest, that it means that you're hiding something and that you're doing naughty things and trying to hide them behind the screen of the corporate governance, of the corporate interest. But you should make it concrete. Yes, you should not. And corporate interest can also be reputation, and corporate interest can also be sustainability on the long run, and corporate interest can also be investments for the future, etc., etc., etc. So it is a void notion. It's probably a very expandable notion, but that is also its advantage and its disadvantage. So mixed answer.
I noticed that the draft on the new Belgian Code of Companies and Associations has slightly amended, added a few words into the what I would call the definition of a corporation. I'm paraphrasing off the top of my head now. I'm sure you'll know it much better, but I think that the classical definition was, and it was in the first draft, the purpose of a company is to make and distribute profits. And now I think it has been amended and it says it's to, the purpose of the company is, amongst others, to make and distribute profits. Is that a change that you think will have legal consequences?
Let's say that I do hope so, yes. Yeah, I think it was a deliberate choice. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Is that a legal rule you would approve of? That the legislator says, well, it's not all about the profit. It's an important part, it's probably the predominant part, but it's not all about the profit. And leaving in the middle what the other interests or purposes might be.
Just one sentence, but I believe Mr. Ackermann is waiting to allow the audience. I would consider this to be an ineffective statement, because within the market game, it doesn't make sense to say this is one among many, but I could elaborate further, but I'm sure Mr. Ackermann is getting nervous.
And we don't want Mr. Ackermann to be nervous, so we open the floor for questions from the audience. Penelope.
Hello, thank you for sharing your thoughts on CSR. I have a question for both of you. So a few days ago in the New York Times, there was an article about regulation in America regarding environmental laws imposing the fact that biofuels, 20% of fuels should be biofuels, which caused a huge increase in demand for palm oil, which in return brought about the chopping down of entire rainforests in Indonesia, burning down these rainforests, causing even more carbon emission, which they actually wanted to prevent with their CSR-inspired regulation. So my question for you is, what do you think are the chances that CSR regulations will have a net positive effect, so taking into account the social costs? And then a sub-question is, how do we know that governments can bring us closer to the CSR optimum? And then, of course, what is the CSR optimum? Who decides what the CSR optimum is? If it's government, why do we think the government can foresee human behavior better than the market can? And why do we think government can foresee these secondary order effects? Because in practice, up until now, there's plenty of examples where the regulation actually was kind of counterproductive. So as you both touched on the subject of being a proponent of hard law, I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you. The answer does not have to be itemized in all different sub-questions.
Now, this was a whole bunch of questions. Let me start with your remark, what makes us believe that governments know better than markets? Now, as I tried to briefly to explain my talk, there are no markets as such. Markets operate under rules, and government's prime task is to define and enforce proper rules for the market. What are proper rules? In a democracy, that means rules that make the market work in the way that the constituents, the citizens, members of the political community consider desirable. That is government's task in a democracy. Now, you mentioned one example about the legal requirement that a certain amount, certain percentage has to be biofuel. Now, this is a good example about what I tried to explain in my talk. It is one thing for CSR advocates in good intentions to proclaim that a certain practice should be honored. The question that as a responsible political community we have to ask ourselves and to process in a proper legislative process or a political process is, okay, if we adopt this practice as a general rule, what will be the consequences? And in light of the consequences, do we want to adopt this rule? Rules are not there for themselves. Rules, we choose rules in order for them to make the game that we play a better game. And it is an empirical question what effects rules will have. And the examples you mentioned is an example where what sounds as a good rule on first sight, on closer inspection, turns out to have undesirable consequences. And so not every demand that on CSR, that under the CSR label sounds nice, turns out under closer examination to be a rule that we would want actually to adopt. Then the CSR optimum, there is no CSR optimum. So the optimum is that we all play nationally and then in the wider sphere, internationally in the world, but that requires rules at that level. The goal is that we play a game that we find desirable and a game that is sustainable, a game that predictably brings us in 100 years into a very unpleasant situation is not a good game. So there is no CSR optimum. The criterion is what will be the outcome of the rules that we adopt for the social, economic, and political games that we play. And the measuring rod is what the people, the persons living under these systems, consider desirable, and not only in the short run, but in the long run.
Just a few additional comments. There are many examples of the example that you gave. So the fact that many young people switch to avocados instead of eating meat until they found out that you need how much? 170 liters of water to grow one avocado. Or the quinoa, where we all of a sudden all started to eating quinoa because it was so healthy and helping the people in South America. And then we were eating so much quinoa that they no longer had the means to afford quinoa and were starving. I think that you have, to a very large extent, already given the answer earlier. First, I don't believe in a CSR optimum. We are human and we will all make mistakes. I do believe, or I hope I can believe, in the natural surviving instinct of humanity. And the balance of that will, or the level of that surviving instinct will not be the same for everybody, but in the end we'll have to survive as a species. And that will, at a certain point in time, force us to take certain measures. I'm not necessarily saying that government is doing, by definition, better than the individual, but at least what we can expect of a government is full information gathering and full information sharing worldwide, so that at least there is a little chance that we take the best decision that is possible and not stupid decision with short-term consequences that are positive and long-term consequences that are negative. And in this respect, I refer back to my example of the discussion on the plastic bottle here in Flanders. That discussion was not held the way it should have been held, because, as you mentioned, there was no discussion on the different alternatives and their consequences.
Okay. I also need to think about the short term, and in the short term we need to finish, but perhaps there is room for one brief question.
Thank you. I'm sorry, it's not a brief question, but you can choose how long you want to answer them. There are 3 questions in the margin of the debate that was very interesting and very nuanced. My first question is, if I understand correctly, Professor Vanberg, you say corporate social responsibility should be played within the limits of the market game. And this brings to me the question, does company law still play in the limits of the market game? Is it that the shareholder is the residual claimant still, that he bears all the risk? Are we not drifting too far from this? They didn't say it were brief questions. Second thing I found very interesting, and I work for a trade union, so I will say that now, is that Professor Wyckaert, she said, the Chinese student defined corporate social responsibility as respecting the law, respecting the rules. And my question is, are we so far from this? If you think about Volkswagen, which is not an obscure company, and I deliberately take Volkswagen because I said I work for a trade union, and it has a governance model that is not shareholder value based alone. Can we say that on the field of accountability of companies for following the rules, the hard rules, that and it's not to say that corporate social responsibility is not important, because it's nuanced and there's a lot that can be done, but it should also not accountability be a bigger factor in these discussions. And then the last question, and then I will leave the floor to you. When we talk about accountability, I always find it, and that's for the lawyers in front, when the EU wants to enforce competition law, they don't look at the company as the separate entities that it is built from, because they say it's not an effective way to enforce competition law. And should we not apply the same thinking to enforcing some other types of accountability? That's the questions.
Shall I pick one and you pick one?
Maybe I can very brief, because I think only the first question was directly to me. I fully agree with what I take to be the thrust of your question, whether the limited liability that applies to corporations is actually in conformity with the basic functioning principles of a market economy, which would demand to strictly couple the profit opportunity and liability. As was mentioned before, I think have been the director of the Valks Ecoteam in Freiburg, which is carrying on the Freiburg school tradition. And this was always one of the big themes of the Freiburg school, that strict liability is one of the founding principles of a functioning market economy. And in this regard, one can actually ask the question whether corporate law is still appropriate in all its aspects with the demands for a well-functioning market economy.
Which is a very far-fetching statement, I agree, but it's a very interesting statement. Let me briefly respond on your second question. Yes, of course, companies should in the very first place adhere to the rules. But the question is, are the rules sometimes good enough? Should they not go further than the rules? And I think corporate social responsibility is sometimes going further than the rules because, as we often repeat it, you cannot always trust the legislator either. And then for your last question, I am not in favor of the preservation of the idea that a legal entity is a closed circle. And I'm very much in favor of developing group law, which we are doing in Belgium, but in the bad way of leaving it, in the poor way of leaving it to case law and indeed the competition law. I would not at all oppose a group law concept like you have in Germany, by the way, in Belgium, but clearly there was no political ground for that. So that maybe answers your questions. There is some group law. Sometimes the corporate field is pierced thanks to indeed case law, but we could do better than we are doing, for sure.
Thank you, Mr. Kosheki, for your interesting questions. I started off with a first sentence of a novel where 4 people go on a search. At the end of that novel, Dwaallicht, that search did not give the desired result, but the search was valuable and enjoyable in itself. And I can conclude that perhaps the same is true for this debate today. We didn't solve the question, but I think it was enjoyable, and we see hopefully more light than we saw at the beginning, or at the very least our confusion is somewhat more enlightened than it was at the beginning. I thank you all, I thank our debaters, I thank again the Valks team, Ekonomika and VRG, and I invite you for the drink which will take place in front of this room. Good night.